All right, we're before round three. Nothing new to report other than I looked at the game with the computer and I was doing totally fine. And I should have just played either e5 or d5 when my opponent pushed f5. And knight g5 was aggressive, but not actually correct. After that, I still could have played d5, but Anyways, a little bit disappointing, but we live with it. I think I'm going to have black in this next round. I mean, there's no guarantee, but probably. Either that or I'll have white and then I'll have black in the last round. But going black, white is kind of nice. So I kind of hope I do have black in this next round. And I think I'll be playing somebody else as 1 out of 2. Unclear who that will be or what's gonna be happening. But yeah, man, I could have beat that guy. Dang. Anyways, see you guys soon.
All right, folks, it's round 3, and this kid Joshua, who was complimenting me on my first game before the second game, is the guy that I was playing. So very nice to be able to play him. He was very amicable at the beginning of the game. We were chatting a little bit, and he plays d4, and then he plays bishop f4 here, and I chuckle a little bit, and he's like, "You're not allowed to laugh until you win the game." I was like, no, you're just playing the London. Reminds me of Eric Rosen. And he's like, it's my uncle. And I was like, yeah, sure, it's your uncle. And he was like, yeah, no, I'm just kidding. Anyways, like I mentioned, I have black here. My opponent's rated 1300, so it's going to be a little bit of an uphill battle, but let's see how it goes. My opponent plays d4. I play knight f6, wanting to play e6 and bishop b4 against c4, right? We play here. We see something like this, and this is a position that the Nimzo Indian is something that we're reasonably comfortable with, and a lot of people with white find this pretty uncomfortable. And I've recently learned some new ideas here where you can play stuff like b6 and bishop b7 to be able to target this long diagonal. The king is always going to castle queenside because of the holes that are over here, and it makes a good use of your light square bishop rather than trapping it behind this d5 pawn, which happens a lot. Although admittedly, one of the things you have to be careful of in the Nimzo Indian is if this pawn ends up backwards here, like if you end up having to play something like this and you have this backwards pawn, it ends up being a real problem for you. Nonetheless, my opponent didn't play c4. They played bishop f4, and this is where I laughed a little bit, and my opponent was like, hey, what's going on? This is a very solid opening, but it gives almost no advantage for white. Basically what it is it's saying, look, I'm just going to play super solidly, and I'm going to know the themes of the position, and you're not, and there's no chance you're going to mate me, and there is some chance that you're going to screw up, and then I'm going to mate you, which, fair enough. So I played e6, wanting to open up this bishop and potentially be able to play c5. Apparently playing c5 right away is also a move. My opponent plays e3. Now that they've gotten this bishop out, they want to build up this strong pawn setter, perhaps at some point play c3. So I play c5, and my opponent does play c3. And I play d5. Now, there's some pros and some cons here. The problem here is that my queenside pieces are going to have some trouble developing. Like this knight, if it goes there, it's got nowhere to go, right? Like pawns literally defending both of those squares. It can't go here because the pawn defends there. You can go over here and try and get into the square, but there's a bishop over here, so it's a little bit tough to say. My opponent plays bishop d3, and there are several different ideas here, but the thing that seemed most reasonable to me was just to do this and go yeah, your bishop can stay on this diagonal, but it's not allowed to do anything. So my opponent does play bishop c2, and I play bishop d7, basically saying, okay, what I'd like to do is put myself in a position where I can get this bishop over here without having to move these pawns, because eventually maybe I want to do something like this, which would be able to get your bishop out. But basically I was like, we should solve the problem of this bishop to some degree. So I did. My opponent played knight d2, which felt like a passive setup, but it's pretty reasonable. Unless his knight's going to go here and here, there's not going to have many places to go. And it can't go to a3 because of the bishop that I have on f8 right now. So this is basically the only place that he can develop this knight. And eventually, perhaps he's going to be able to wheel it over. If he ever pushes this knight here and here, then he can back it up with this second knight. They're a little bit superfluous over there, but that's the downside of the pawn structure that he's chosen to play. So I play knight a6, basically saying, hey, I'd like to be able to eventually wheel around. This is not the best move in the world. Again, I'm not super familiar with the position here. So basically the opening plan that my opponent has, where they want to know the position and I don't, they're getting. It's plus 1.4 right here. My problem is e4, a break in the center. If I play knight takes, pawn takes, then I have this awkward pawn structure, not to mention the fact that they can just play bishop takes, and now I have to find some way to defend this pawn. This is not great for me. So I just play bishop c6. This reminds me a little bit of French defenses, right? When you're playing white, basically you end up having to defend your d4 pawn. So defending your d5 pawn, it feels the same except symmetric. It's on the queen side of the board still, but feels very familiar. My opponent plays queen e2, basically reinforcing some of the threats here. Now I can't play pawn takes if my opponent chooses to take. And I play knight c7. This is another idea that I had. Basically, when I played over here, I wanted to get to the center of the board. and the computer thinks I'm doing like okay-ish. My opponent took, which surprised me. That didn't seem like the best move here, but I played queen takes, and it does remove one defender of this pawn, but like no problem. E takes, and obviously this pawn is pinned. I could take with the knight, but then this isn't developed. So apparently the computer wants me to play knight takes, and it's just like, this knight is great, and if it ever moves, then you have threats here. But I played bishop takes because I wanted to threaten this. And my opponent stops that threat by playing knight gf3, basically saying, yeah, you can take here, but my queen's going to take, like, no big deal. So I played bishop d6, finally getting myself in a position to castle. And my opponent plays bishop a4 check, basically saying, no, you may not castle. This turns out not to be a great move, but it at least prevents me from castling, and my opponents might be able to castle. So I play king e7, and what it seems like now is that my opponent is going to be able to put some more pressure here by playing knight e5. Basically, I can take, but when my opponent takes with a pawn, the queen can't take because the queen is defending here, so I have to play like knight somewhere like here, but then the queen takes, so like, where's this knight going? Is it really going back there? Like, then the bishop's there, and this pawn is here, and like, what's going on with this open file? In theory, that could be fine. Really, what it wants me to play is rook hc8 here, which I don't know how I'm supposed to see that. And then like bishop takes is fine because my opponent doesn't have a dark square bishop, so like me giving up mine is not that big a deal, and all his pawns are on dark squares, so it's not like that bishop's going to be great anyways. But I play a6, basically going, I want to kick this bishop out, and then I can figure out what to do. The bishop doesn't seem very effective if it's over there. And then my opponent plays knight d takes c4. Basically, now they've put enough pressure here, and I can play b5 right away. And basically, the idea is there is here, I think knight takes, queen takes, and then bishop b3 or c2. And basically, this is slightly better for black, though I'm not sure that I understand why. I'm down a pawn, and yeah, my rooks are going to be able to get active or whatever, but I don't see why this is great for me. It's good for me because I get the pawn back over here, which is similar to what happened in the game. Instead of doing all of that, I played bishop takes g2 directly. So basically, like, I didn't lose a pawn. We both lost a pawn. This variation is slightly better for white, as we'll see. Rook g1, bishop h3, and knight takes d6, queen takes d6, and rook g3, kicking this bishop. Now, I was trying to figure out if there's anywhere to go other than the f5 square. Like, I'd love to be able to go here, but, like, obviously takes, and I've lost two pieces for a rook. And the computer agrees this is not great for me. It's +3. So I play bishop f5, like, no problem. And my opponent plays knight c4, basically saying, where's your queen going to go? I play queen c7, no problem. Want to defend all of the infiltration squares of the knight. If your knight goes here, it's kind of annoying, but it's not that big a deal. My opponent does, in fact, go there. And I play b5, finally kicking this bishop. Bishop here, takes, and queen takes. And in this position, the thing that I'm trying to figure out is, like, how do I defend this pawn? I could play knight h5, but I'm a little bit worried about what happens if the queen comes back here, or if obviously the queen can't go there, but if the queen comes back here to attacking the knight, then how do I make sure that, like, the knight is appropriately defended? The computer just says play here. And if rook takes, knight takes e5, this wins the rook. I didn't see that at all. And I was worried about defending this pawn, so I was like, yeah, no problem, g6. And then my opponent played rook f3, and I was like, oh, no. And the reason is, if I move my knight, rook takes, which takes my queen. So, like, obviously, I can't move this knight. Like, none of the moves with the knight are going to be any good. I played queen b7, wanting to threaten this so that if the knight ever goes anywhere, then, like, I can take the rook. That's kind of a waste of time. And my opponent should play something like queen d2 to get ready to really pile up here. But my opponent plays queen c1, which is kind of the same idea. And my opponent missed queen e4 check, which is correct, but I should just be down a piece here. Like, this knight is going to be gone. My opponent just calmly plays, like, king f1, then, like, what am I going to do? Like, I have all the same problems. At the very least, I'm losing this pawn. So it just wants me to play something like h6, and it's like, yeah, this sucks. But my opponent didn't do that. My opponent played queen e3, and I was like, great, that seems great. So I took, my opponent took with the f-pawn, and I played rook hf1, or hf8, rather. So I seem to be doing fine now. It's +1 for my opponent, but, like, I feel okay. I'm going to be able to move this knight here and trade off, and then my opponent has stuff over here, I have stuff over there, and we're going to have a game. It's, 6 pawns versus 6 pawns, so this feels equal-ish. My opponent plays king e2. He wants to get a second rook over here, and I play knight d7. My opponent had one more tempo, so I play something like this. then this becomes difficult for us. Obviously, you can see it's +5. Like, there's just too many threats against this knight and against this pawn. There's no way to defend this a second time. So I play knight d7 just in time. Takes. My opponent plays rook af1. And then I play f5, which is the only move that's going to be able to protect this pawn. There's no other way to be able to, I mean, I can, in theory, perhaps I can play like a king here. But this is not great. My opponent can play basically rook f6, totally lock it down. March the pawn down the board, like start to get his king. My king is now forever tied down. I can't get I can get a second rook over there, but then I'm playing defensively. So none of that seems good. I played f5, reasonable. My opponent plays e4, and I was like, yeah, it's fine, but I don't have to take it. Obviously takes, and I have lost a rook for a pawn, so terrible. So I play rook ae8. I'm like, look, you take, I'll take. It'll be check, and then I'll be able to take over the open file with my rooks, and that'll be great. In fact, if we take a look at what that looks like with for the computer, they play king d3. I go here. Perhaps my opponent could play something like this, but then I go here. And yeah, you can see this is mildly advantageous for black because I control the only open file. It's going to be hard to target this weakness. I've got a 3-on-1 on this side, and my king is in front of my opponent's 4-on-2 on this side. So it's equal, but this seemed fine for me. And so my opponent plays e5, sort of shutting this down. Now this is backwards, and I was like, yeah, but I don't care. Now my king's super safe. So I was like, okay, g5. Like, I'm just going to start pushing my majority. Your majority's over here. My king's already here to stop it. No problem. My opponent plays rook h3, and I say, okay, I got to defend some stuff. My opponent plays rook h6. I play rook eg8, trying to make sure that this is defended. Also, I want to be able to play rook h6 to kick this out. My opponent plays d5. Obviously, if takes, then takes, and this is not great for me. It's +1 for my opponent. But I was like, no, if you take me, then I just take with the king. But I can only do that if first I block here. Obviously, if I make a nothing move here, then obviously you can just play pawn takes, and the king can't take because the rook is defending. So I stop that by playing rook g6. And the computer really likes this move. If we turn on the feedback, it goes, yes, that is best. And I think it says that it's in the thing. It says that this is a great move. Actually, it says rook eg8 to get over here is a great move, but fine enough. So this endgame is going to end up being long, but really interesting. So rook h5, play h6. Again, the computer approves of this move. My opponent plays d6. Again, I literally don't care. I play rook f8. It turns out rook f8 is wrong. It wants me to play rook c8 to be able to get over here and do stuff with these pawns. Basically, take control of my semi-open file. These pawns are like really hard for my opponent to be able to attack. And if my opponent does something like this, then I obviously can just like move my rook back if I need to. But on top of that, I can at some points play g4 to make that impossible for my opponent to do. And they basically have a rook that's sort of like stuck over here doing nothing. I can lock that rook out of the game. So if I play over here, yeah, if my opponent plays something like this, I can just play g4. They're never going to be able to infiltrate to attack this pawn. They have to figure, they play something like rook e3, and I'm getting in here, right? I'm going to be able to push, and I'm going to control all these squares, and my opponent's going to have to figure out how to stop some of that. And like that's all going to be difficult. Anyways, I play rook f8 because I want to be able to push all of this stuff. My opponent plays rook h3, and I say, great, g4, get out of there. You can either come in and be trapped forever, or you can get out. He decides to save his rook, and I play h5. Turns out this is the wrong kind of plan. I should just go ahead and get moving with the f-pawn right away, but this is not the worst thing in the world. We still nurse a small advantage. My opponent goes here, so now I can't play f4, and that actually causes some problems for me. I play h4. I'm like, look, I'm just going to go here and here and here and here and here. What are you going to do? My opponent says, well, my king is there to stop stuff, which, fair, his king is there to stop stuff. That's reasonable. And I go here, because I'm like, no, I really am going to push this. My opponent plays c4. They're like, I literally don't care. I thought about taking rook takes here, but now that there's no rook behind this, I can't push. So, yeah, he's starting to get his 3-on-2 moving. So I play g3 check, which is not a good move. This goes from a mild advantage for black. I've been slowly losing it to totally equal, and it wants me to play rook takes, and then here, and that's like fine. But I play pawn takes. My opponent plays king g2, and I play rook g4. Now, again, it wants me to play rook c8 and basically be like, yeah, you could take this pawn, but then I'm taking all of these with check. Good luck, my guy. I should have seen this, but fine. I play here because I'm like, yeah, trade me rooks, and then I'm going to be able to push. And he does trade me rooks. And then he takes over there. Obviously, I have to take back. This is a small mistake here. My opponent should take. And then even if I take here, this is a winning endgame for my opponent because how am I ever going to deal with this? So c takes, a takes b5, and again, my opponent, I guess now this is less problematic because this pawn is actually going to be able to do stuff over here. But my opponent now plays rook takes g3, and obviously I'm not going to trade these rooks because this endgame doesn't seem good for me with this pawn all the way on d6. So I play rook e4. I'm like, I'll take this pawn. My opponent checks, and I can move up with my king, but I played what is... So this loses, this really loses, and this loses unbelievably. But this is fine. So I play king t8, so that's actually the only move, surprisingly. And I was just like, I don't care if you push your pawn. If your rook ever moves, I'm going to be able to take it. Your king has to get all the way down here, and if that happens, then I'm just going to push this pawn. No big deal. And in the meantime, I'm still threatening to take this. So my opponent plays king f3. I take the e5 pawn. My opponent plays rook e7. And I'm like, okay, fine, you're attacking this, so I can't go over here. Like, one thing I thought about was this. Well, obviously not that, but then, like, this. And this should be even, but then I've got to, in figuring out what the appropriate trades are here, basically it's a 2v1 for my opponent, and I was like, I don't like that. We end up with something similar in the game, but right now it's 3 versus 3, and I'm like, well, I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to go here, and your king is still trapped in the box. Your king's over here. My king's trapped along the first rank, but in order for you to make progress, you're going to have to move this rook at some point. So, like, you can't push these pawns, really, because this pawn stands in the way. So my opponent plays a3. They're like, like zugzwang, and I'm like, it's not zigzag, my guy. I can still push these pawns. They're two connected passers. So, like, you got to figure out what to do. My opponent says rook b7. He'd like to take this pawn. And I'm like, yeah, okay, that's fine. You can go here. My opponent plays rook takes b5. And I thought, okay, I can play here with check, but then my opponent plays here. And then when I go here, then he's going to take. And then I've got to figure out how to defend this pawn. So maybe I can't play here because the king is defending. So maybe if I push, but then the rook is going to be able to get behind. And then I have to figure out some way to be able to go over here. So I just say, okay, I'm going to take the d6 pawn now. And if he takes here, then I'm going to go back here, which is exactly what happened. My opponent plays rook e2. Now, obviously, takes, and, like, this is hugely winning for white. So, like, no thank you. Your king is still not allowed to move forward. And my opponent plays rook here. And so, finally, it's time, now that there's no pawn here for my king to stop, it's time to get my king into the game. Now, I could go king e7, but then this comes with check. And so I was like, we'll just go here. And now his rook can't go to... this square, this square, this square, this square along the file. Can't go this square along the rank. So, like, it's got to figure out somewhere to go in order to do something. And he plays b4. That's fine, but then check and I take this pawn. And the fact that your rook is now on this side instead of this side is bad for you. So I think rook c2 is not great for my opponents. I think if they just play something like b4 straight away, they're probably in a better position. Because if I play check, they're going to play rook e3. And obviously I can't take. So I just have to, like, go back. So moving the rook onto this c file was the mistake there. So I play there and I take, and my opponent can take here. And so now the question is I have to get my king somewhere in front of this pawn, but that's not actually going to be that hard. So I play king b3, rook b3. My opponent plays rook c4, no problem. I move my king up. My opponent moves their king here to block my king around. And I'm like, okay, well, if I move my king back, then my opponent's going to be able to, like, infiltrate and do some stuff. And I'm like, well, I can just move my rook around. Like, this is not a problem. It turns out king e6 is also fine, preventing my king from moving forward. But if I play something like king d7, it gives my opponent better winning chances. So I'm just like, I'm not moving my rook. I'm just going to keep my rook trained on the pawn. Like, what are you going to do? You have to get your king all the way around. And when that happens, I play king d5. I think rook c5 check is probably better because that just forces me to go back. My opponent's gained a little bit of a tempo in order to be able to go over here. But my opponent plays rook d4 check. And I'm like, great, I can move my king in front of the pawn. Obviously, if I move my king over here, now I'm just cut off, and this is bad. My opponent plays king c4. If a check happens, then my opponent can get in front of the pawn. Like, my king is forever cut off. This is losing. So I do have to keep my king in front of the pawn. No problem. King c2, attacking my rook. And I'm like, yeah, whatever. I'll just move my rook over here. Like, you can't push the pawn. You can't move your rook up. Like, you could play this check, I guess, but then I go here and attack both of your pieces. So my opponent plays king b3. So I play king b6. I don't want to go here because when this comes with check, then I've got to, like, do some stuff. So I'm like, I'll play king b6. You still can't check me. Like, then I'll just step up. Like, this is not a problem. My opponent plays rook c4, sort of trapping me over here. And I play rook b1 check because it's like, look, yeah, come get me. King c2, rook h1. Well, how are you going to make progress? You can't move your king forward, right? This is exactly the same as what it was a few moves ago. If we go back to here, this is basically the same, except now my king is on b5 instead of c6. So I'm the one who's made progress in this position. Sorry, I don't know why the screen is lagging. I don't know what to tell you. So my opponent plays king c2. I play h1. My king's literally, instead of on c6, it's on b6, like, no problem. He plays rook g4, and I play king b5. I'm like, I'm going to come get this pawn. And he plays king c3, and I play rook h3 check, and I'm like, you can't move here to defend. I'm gonna be able to go here at some point. If your king moves back, I can just sort of check you forever. He plays king d2. I play rook b3, now getting behind this pawn. And so, like, what are you gonna do? So my opponent plays king c2 because that's as close as I can get to attacking my rook. I take, and now obviously if takes, this is a draw. So my opponent plays rook g5, and I say, do you want to draw? And he says no, and I say, I mean, okay, but this is a draw. I'm happy to play it out. So we play I play king c6. He plays king c3. I play rook f4. And so it says here, but I just stopped note taking because I was like, we were both pretty low on time. We were at the point where like my opponent had 25 minutes and I had like 10 minutes, and then it got down to the point where like we both had like, oh, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong sheet over here. I think we're actually like much deeper into the game. Yeah, we're at the point where we both have like 5 minutes. I think I have 3 minutes and my opponent has 5 minutes or something. And I'm like, I mean, this is I've defended one of these in a game where both of us had 30 seconds with a 2-second increment. This is just not that hard to defend. So there's like 30 more moves to this game, and then eventually my opponent goes, yeah, okay, draw. When it got to the point where like I was the one checking his king rather than he was the one checking my king. But I was like, yeah, okay, whatever. So we get a draw here. That's actually good news for us. Drawing a higher rated opponent is good. So now the average person that we've played is actually higher rated than us. We take that. And so let's see what that does to our chess rating. Oh, and I forgot to mention this before we moved on. We can see that in this game, if we flip here, my opponent played 81.2. I played 81.5, so I slightly outplayed my opponent. And the great move that I played was this rook eg1. So I was pleased with that. Again, like you can see my opponent had some chances here, and then I had some chances, but I missed them. And then I was able to draw, including a bunch of only moves. So I felt pretty good about this one. All right, so after round 3, we played a 13-11, score of 1.5. So our new tournament performance rating is 1229, nice improvement, and our new rating is 1146. So pretty decent. Let's take a look at the graph. All right, so after round 3, you can again see from our first round win, we gained about 16 points. Our second round loss, we lost about 11, and then it turns out drawing somebody so higher rated actually got us a lot of points as well. So we got another plus 12, which we'll take. That's not so bad.
Man, what a game. So we were playing Joshua Garrow, who's rated 13-11, I think. And he had 1.5 out of 2, and we had 1 out of 2. And we have black, actually, which is kind of surprising because we get to play white in the last round, I think. But he was a D4 player. He's a London player. And so the London doesn't bother me that much. It's fine. It's not an opening that I, like, understand how to, like, to, though. Anyways, solid opening for my opponent. Like, nothing's really going on. And we end up trading some pieces, and I'm worried about losing a pawn, but I'm able to come up with some tactics that save some stuff, and then there happen to be some resources. I almost lose a knight, but there happen to be some resources that save it. Although if you like look at the graph, there's a moment where my opponent's like +8, and they just don't capitalize correctly. They missed a move, and rather than just calmly playing king f1, they traded queens, which saved me tremendously. And we ended up in a 2 Rook Endgame, which I think I was ahead by like 0.5 or something. Maybe a little bit more. I don't exactly know. I did look at this one with the computer. I misplayed a little bit, and then he's up like +2, but then he misplays it a little bit. It's one of those things where you have to be like very technically correct in order for it to work out. And we end up rook versus rook, and I offer him a draw, and he says no, and I said okay, it's a there's like a book draw, but whatever. So I think I said it's a technical draw. Like there's no. But fine, I'll play it out. So we just play a bunch of moves. I stop taking. He stops once I get below 5 minutes. He stops note taking. And once we get to the point where we're just like obviously just gonna play to a draw, I stop note taking. So it's just us shuffling our kings and our rooks around, and eventually he goes like, "Yeah, there's no way I'm ever gonna part this man from his rook because I'm never gonna put my rook and my king on the same rank or file. So then like there's nothing he can do, and I'm gonna do all I can to like induce a rook trade. I've had to play that endgame out before. Luckily he like didn't wait for the 50 move rule, because that wasn't counting. There's no, Anyways, I totally respect that out of him. He's now I think 2 out of 3, and I'm 1.5 out of 3. So this next game determines whether or not it's an up, in the middle, or a down tournament. But I've played 2 players that are rated 1300 and another one that's rated. The other one is rated 955. So I think that might mean. I mean, after the fact, I'll show you I'll do the whole like graph like I normally do. But I think that this means this is probably a slight increase in rating for me, right? Going 1.5 out of 3 against a 955, a 1387, and a 1311. I'll go compute that. Anyways, I'm feeling pretty decent about it, but I've got to play white against somebody that's doing pretty well for the last game of the day. So we'll see how that goes. Yeah, feeling good. Good to talk to you all.